Here we have a video about the Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare, focusing on Act 1. This is obviously for the aspects of comedy module, and this is for A-level English literature. In this video, I'm going to be looking at both scenes of Act 1, because there are two. It is obviously the beginning, the exposition of the play, so it's to do a lot with setting up the central plot, really, and the central storylines. And I'll also be giving you some key quotes as well as we go through those summaries of the scenes. As we go through as well, I'll be talking about some significant aspects of comedy that we see, and then we will also focus on Petruchio's language, and we'll finish off by looking at some important contextual factors relating to what we see in this act. So this is all about Act 1. So let's go into a summary then of what happens in Act 1, Scene 1. So this is the beginning of the play, not technically, because by this point we've had the induction, so we've already started to watch something on stage. So this is when we meet the main characters for the first time, and the actual play itself begins, I should say, in terms of the Shrew idea. We start by seeing Lucentio enter the stage, and he is a student, or at least he starts as a student, and he pledges to study quite hard, and he is going to use his time in Padua as somebody to enhance his education. He is accompanied by his loyal servant Tranio, and you would not know necessarily that they were master-servant based on the relationship and the speech that they have, because they are very friendly, and that's what you would obviously expect from a comedy. There isn't really a very big power divide between the characters. Masters and servants can be very friendly in comedies. And Tranio says to him not to study too hard, to make sure he also has some fun, and that he shouldn't become like a prisoner to his own studying. So Tranio really reminds Lucentio that while he's in Padua, he should also have a little bit of fun. It's not all about studying. Importantly, at that point, after that opening interactions between the two of them, Baptista and his two daughters enter, and they're also accompanied by Gremio and Hortensio as well. And Lucentio and Tranio stand to one side of the stage, and in some versions they stand on the balcony at the top of the stage, which in terms of dramatic methods, of course, allows them to overhear what Baptista is saying to his two daughters, as well as to see the two daughters for the first time, but also to hear what Hortensio and Gremio are saying as well. So it's a really important dramatic method that Lucentio and Tranio are kept on stage to one side, because it enables them to overhear some important information. In terms of the subplot of this play, the subplot is concerned with Lucentio and Bianca, and this is the beginning of that, because it's by spotting Bianca from the balcony that he falls instantly in love with her, and that determines really his behaviour and what he thinks about for the rest of the play. By seeing Kate and Bianca on stage from an audience perspective, we understand what the two sisters are like. We understand very simply at this point that Bianca is the quiet and compliant one, in other words, the typical Shakespearean woman, and Kate is the shrew. So Kate and Bianca are almost foil characters. They're complete opposites, and Baptista also makes it very clear that he has a favourite, and his favourite is Bianca, as demonstrated in that quote there at the very bottom of this slide. Obviously, we don't know yet, but Bianca gets a little bit more manipulative later on, and she's more outspoken than we perhaps give her credit for in this part of the play, when we see her for the first time. And Kate is also saying that Bianca has successfully got Baptista wrapped around her little finger. But Kate is the one that says that she's manipulative, and that seems to be true when we see Bianca and her behaviour later in the play. Next, in terms of the context, Gremio and Hortensio are both suitors to Bianca, and they are quite frustrated with Baptista for keeping Bianca locked away and forbidden really from dating, as we might say now. And Baptista says that the reason for that is that he wants to get Kate, the eldest sister, married before the younger one. So until Kate is married off, so to speak, nobody has permission to get to Bianca. So this poses the central problem, and this is why Baptista we could call Baptista the comic villain, because he poses a barrier to the happiness of the couples. Comedy is often about the pursuit of a love interest. So to have older characters getting in the way of that can be what frustrates the plot, but also causes a problem that the men have to try and get around and deviate from. So the central problem is, how will Bianca's three suitors, which includes Lucentio as well, marry her if Kate stays single? And at the minute it seems that Kate will stay single forever because of her outrageous and shrewish behaviour. We also hear that Baptista plans to hire some tutors to go in to instruct each daughter at home. Contextually, again, this was a time when girls tended to leave education in school a long time before boys did. So girls tended to leave school at about the age of 10. And if the family was wealthy enough and if they wanted to invest more hours into their daughter's education, then they would employ some school tutors at home. And that's what Baptista intends to do, and in fact what actually happens. It's really important that Lucentio hears that from Baptista, because Lucentio then opportunistically and resourcefully uses that school tutor motif as a device to go and see Bianca, perhaps sooner than he should. For example, we see that in Act 3, Scene 1. Once Baptista and the two girls have left stage, Hortensio and Gremio, despite being rivals for Bianca's love and attention, agree to work together to try and help find a husband for Kate, because by finding a husband for Kate, it means that they'll have access to Bianca and be able to court her and woo her as so they wish. So despite being rivals, they agree to work together. Then what happens, because those characters then go off stage, we go back to Lucentio and Tranio, and it's really important that for Act 1, Scene 1, we remember that Lucentio and Tranio have heard the entirety of that conversation, because hearing that conversation drives the plot forward. Lucentio, first of all, has been thoroughly struck by Cupid's arrow. It's almost love at first sight. And the studying that he planned to do in the beginning quickly goes out of the window, and he instead is completely consumed with his lust and affection for Bianca. Tranio, though, is important because Tranio, as the realist, I suppose, reminds Lucentio that there is a problem. And that problem clearly is Kate, who they've just seen on stage. The problem is Lucentio was so love-struck that he completely forgot this problem. So in that kind of that phrase there, I burn, I pine, I perish, really does show Lucentio's the way in which he has been consumed by love for this younger sister. Once they discuss Kate and the problem that she poses, the way in which Lucentio and Tranio decide to proceed is they agree to swap clothes. So Lucentio becomes a school tutor called Cambio, and Tranio becomes Lucentio, so nobody notices that Lucentio has gone missing while he's dressed as somebody else. This encourages dramatic irony, because obviously we've got to remember as an audience who's who and also what is motivating them. This play often pivots on the theme of transformation, whether that's physical transformation through the adoption of somebody else's clothes through the skies, or whether it's emotional transformation such as being tamed. This is a play fundamentally about transformation and going between two different things, really. Swapping clothes creates disequilibrium. I've already done a video about disequilibrium and how deviation and breaks from normality and transformation, all of these things creates comedic material, because it's that disparity between expected behaviour and actually the kind of situations that characters get themselves in through choosing to deceive. It's a deliberate deception. It's not accidental. So they deliberately choose to deceive, and that's why that disequilibrium is caused. Biondello enters as well. So at this point, Biondello is both of their friends. He's not an enemy of them. The three of them have this kind of trio friendship. And to complicate matters further, Lucentio tells Biondello that the reason why Tranio and Lucentio have had to swap clothes is because Lucentio has killed a man and needs to go into hiding. This is, of course, nonsense. That isn't true. So they're also deceiving Biondello as well. Okay, so that's Act 1, Scene 1. So that's really establishing the subplot. And at this point, before we see Petruchio for the first time, the question that we have as an audience is, how on earth are they going to get with Bianca if Kate remains single? Remember, Gremio and Hortensio have agreed to find a husband for Kate. So it's very coincidental that that very man suddenly turns up, moments later. But of course, without Petruchio, we wouldn't have a plot. So we need Petruchio, despite it being a quite coincidental appearance. So Act 1, Scene 2 is all about Petruchio, really, and introducing him as a character. And I often have a lot of fun teaching students about how Petruchio is conveyed in this scene because of his language and because of his behaviour. Petruchio is an embodiment of the Il Capitano stock character from the Italian tradition of theatre called commedia dell'arte, which Shakespeare has been inspired by in terms of the characterisation and use of stock characters. So Petruchio's entrance is quite climactic, I suppose. It's all about him. He's sometimes regarded as quite a narcissistic character. He's very resourceful, opportunistic. And whereas on the one hand you might accuse Petruchio of being misogynistic and nasty and bullying, and not having Kate's interests at heart, abusive. On the other hand, you could view him perhaps as being incredibly entertaining because of his wit and because of his resourcefulness and the lengths that he will go to eventually to tame Kate. Petruchio is there to get some worldly experience. He's gone travelling. He's from Verona, and he is here. His father has just died. He has money. He tells us that relatively quickly. And he's also accompanied by Grumio, his servant. Grumio is important in this scene because he manages to maintain comic relief. Because the first confusion that's caused with these two characters is this confusion about knocking at the gate. So what Petruchio wants Grumio to do is knock on Hortensio's door, but Grumio misunderstands and he thinks that Petruchio has told him to hit him. And it descends into this kind of chaos and this kind of confusion between the two of them, because Grumio isn't as quick-witted as Petruchio. So the two characters are almost foil characters. One is very quick-witted and intelligent and can use language very resourcefully. The other one is a bit dim-witted, and it also shows through sometimes through accents and kind of clothing as well. So the two of them are very opposites. Are quite opposites in this scene. We like Grumio though because he keeps us laughing. You could say Grumio perhaps is a lovable rogue, as is also perhaps Tranio and Petruchio to some extent. Despite the opening quarrel about knocking at the door, Hortensio gets them both to forgive each other and reconcile, and that's obviously common in comedy, reconciliation. And after Petruchio has explained why he has left Verona, you have that alliterative phrase, wive it wealthily. Hearing that, Hortensio opportunistically then quickly confronts Petruchio with the prospect of marrying a shrew, which we obviously know from looking at the last scene is Kate. And the speed at which he brings that up is quite farcical, because he goes straight to the jugular. It's not very tactfully done. And the reason why that's the case is because Hortensio clearly is in competition with Grumio. He wants to be with Bianca quick and first, in order to outdo Grumio, but also, he doesn't know it yet, but also outdo Lucentio as well. So Hortensio has invested interests in getting back Petruchio to be with Kate and agree to marry a shrew. Petruchio is interested right from the get-go, really, in marrying a shrew. Perhaps he's motivated by money, or how his reputation would be enhanced, maybe by being able to tame a disobedient woman that it seems all the other men are quite scared of. So he's got his own kind of reputation in mind, perhaps in his own bank account in mind, so to speak. Hortensio trivially dismisses her faults, which is obviously very comic because it's quite a big fault actually. And he decides that he's going to liaise with Baptista about dowries and things, as would be the custom at the time, and also pursue Kate, really. He doesn't want to back down, and he goes into this quite hyperbolic monologue about how powerful he is. And he's constantly using quite powerful weather, like thunder, to metaphorically depict his power and his command. At this point, the subplot is developed a little bit more because Lucentio enters as Cambio. He's swapped clothes, obviously. We've got to remember that for dramatic irony. And he's with Gremio, and Gremio is going to present Lucentio to Baptista to tutor Bianca. Gremio thinks that Lucentio is going to act in Gremio's best interest, and certainly Lucentio kind of creates that impression, but actually Lucentio is in it for himself, and he's going to actually be Gremio's rival. So he presents Lucentio / Cambio as the school tutor in preparation to present him to Baptista. And then Hortensio, equally, in kind of a parallel, also hints of finding a tutor for Bianca, although in the next scene it obviously turns out to be him in disguise. So again, this school tutor idea is quite farcical because you've got that parallelism between how they're using the school tutor device in the opening scenes. And then as we get towards the end of the scene, we get to the point where Gremio is shocked that Petruchio is willing to woo Kate. He kind of stands aghast because they've been fearful of her for so many years, let's say, and they never thought anybody would be heroic enough to tame Kate or be with her. And now Petruchio comes as this kind of sacrificial, heroic character to do just that. It's very surprising to the characters. And Petruchio then gives another monologue in which he is presenting his power and command. I'm going to look at that in more detail in a second regarding authorial and dramatic methods. So I'll look at the language of that in a second. But we could call that monologue audacious, theatrical. It's all about himself because Petruchio really is often all about himself. He's quite egotistical, and that can make him foolish, but it can also make him a lovable rogue and quite entertaining to watch. He wants to be seen as a brave warrior, of course. And then finally, Traino then appears. He's now obviously being Lucentio, and we know that now because we've already seen the first scene. And sometimes Traino overacts, so he kind of tries too much to be deceitful by alluding to the wig he's wearing, by speaking in a tone of voice that might not be familiar to him, as a way to kind of over-egg, I suppose, Lucentio's higher status. Again, the two of them, as we said for scene one, Traino and Lucentio's friendship and the loyalty between them blurs the master-servant boundary, and that's often true in comedy. There's a much more binary approach to master-servant relationships in tragedy than comedy. It also shows how comedy and disguise can help characters cross socio-economic boundaries and divides without consequence. There's no consequence in comedy to this deception. They might get a slap round the chops, but it's not going to be like in tragedy where there's bloodletting and mass murder. Traino, remember, importantly, is pretending to want to be with Bianca because he's playing the role of Lucentio, so he has to pretend. Clearly he has no interest in her really, but he's giving the pretense of that in front of Gremio and also Hortensio. He's doing it all for Lucentio's sake. And the scene ends with the men really pledging to have a drink and to basically discuss matters further. But notice in terms of dramatic methods that there's no women in this scene, and yet that's really all the men talk about. So it again shows patriarchal-wise how the future and destinies of women at this time were very much concerned with the men's choices and the men's requirements, and also monetary significance as well. So again, the fact that there are no women in this scene shows that women are quite voiceless in this kind of man's world. So that is a summary of Act 1, Scene 2, with the key quotes there in red. So like I said, I just want to now turn to AO2, and if you were ever to get an extract, or if you ever wanted to write an essay about Petruchio, he often offers a very nice and convenient opportunity to talk about language analysis for AO2. So AO2 is dramatic methods. It can be language, of course, but it can also be any logistical choices in staging. So stage positioning, who dominates conversations, who doesn't, props, music, tone of voice, all of these things. It's not just about the language, it can also be about anything else that creates meaning on stage. But as we can see here in this monologue, and I'm not really going to go through it because you can obviously pause the video, you can see that we've got lots to say about language for Petruchio. He's a wordsmith. Rhetorical devices like anaphora and sentence types as well, and rhetorical questions show that dominance. Again, of note here is what I've got in blue, the semantic field to do with battles and loudness. It's quite onomatopoeic in places, and that conflicts with the little din that he accuses Kate of having, even though he hasn't met her yet. So he's trying to establish himself as this heroic and capable warrior figure who is more powerful than Kate, and that's why you've got that phrase, two roaring fires. They're both, similar in the sense they're both kind of outspoken. So at this point, we're kind of wondering how are they going to get on when they see each other for the first time in the next scene, Act 2, Scene 1. We're eagerly awaiting their first meeting. At the end there, he, in that exclamative, tush, tush, which means he's kind of dismissive of the fear that the other men have of Kate. He's kind of reducing and mitigating her shrewishness as being no match for his own command. So again, it's all about kind of presenting him as this heroic figure. So some information there about language. Again, obviously you can pause the video and annotate that yourself if you have access to the script. But I would say that Petruchio does offer some lovely examples of some language analysis that you could use. Finally, context AO3. I want to make it very clear that one of the reasons why we study literature is because it helps us understand who we were in previous centuries, who we are now, and also who we want to be in the future. So these really are historical literary documents, these plays. For us in obviously the 21st century, it's odd to be talking about taming of women. Maybe it's not our reality, but it would have been the reality of the audience at the time, and they would have been very familiar with the idea of a shrew, of a scold. They would have been very familiar with the prospect of a man having to tame a woman. That would not have been alien to them as it is to us now. Context, of course, has to be relevant to what you're saying. You can't just throw it in and hope for the best. You have to use context as a way to help establish the significance of what you're saying. So use context sparingly, but make sure that what you do say with context is relevant to what you're saying and what you see perhaps in the extract or what you're talking about in a regular essay. So this was a time when being a scold or a shrew was taboo. It was punishable and publicly as well. So women were often publicly humiliated if they were found guilty of gossiping or answering back or not following orders of the men in their lives. And they could also be put on a horse backwards and paraded through the streets, and people would laugh and point at them. They would sometimes be placed in a chair and dunked in water, giving the impression of drowning, again for public amusement. And gossiping and talking back would also result in wearing a scold's bridle, which was what you saw in the front of this PowerPoint, which is the picture of the woman with like a bird cage on her head, which had a metal rod that went into her mouth, which suppressed the tongue, which meant that she couldn't speak. And again, she was paraded through the streets for public ridicule. So again, this is what would have been the reality of the time. It's not our reality maybe now, but it would have been at the time. And obviously Shakespeare could only write about the reality of his time because he didn't know what was going to happen centuries later. So we have to remember that. In terms of context as well, obviously the school tutor idea is important. Again, like with the realities of shrews, an audience in Shakespearean time would have been more familiar with school tutors being employed and being used in the home, so that would have been more normal than now. But also the order of which the daughters are going to be married off. It was common for older daughters to be married before younger ones. Something else for context, finally, about dowries. A lot of what Petruchio says in Act 1, Scene 2 is about money. You know, he says, wive it wealthily. So he's motivated, in part at least, at the beginning, with the prospect of getting a dowry from Baptista. As you know, he actually gets 2 dowries at the end. He gets another one at the end because Kate has been changed beyond all recognition. And Baptista says, another dowry for another daughter. So he actually gets 2 dowries in this play to add to his existing wealth. But that's also contextual because marriage as a money-making exercise might differ from our own perceptions of marriage now. So that is a revision video all about Act 1. I hope that's useful and good luck in your studies. Thank you.